currently. Adriano Cienega, who did most of the work. Larry and I helped. Sheila helped. Probably roughly half the people in this room probably helped put together this presentation in one way or another. You may not realize it. But the person who did a lot of the sort of work corralling all the data about the state of the Cienega watershed was Adriano Cienega, who's in London right now, doing work on a separate project. And then Larry Fisher is not here because he has to be in Singapore translating for Mad Dog Mattis as we speak. So he had other things to do. So this has been an effort probably for over 5 years now for the Cienega Watershed Partnership to lead an effort to describe the state of the watershed, in which we're just outside of, we're over here in the Baba Kamari right now. And the objective has been to sort of monitor the state of the Cienega watershed, understand how it's changing over time, and how it's changing over time in different dimensions, both water, climate, biology, ecology, as well as cultural and social resources within the basin. And so just to orient you again, right, here's the watershed, here's the Las Ciénegas National Conservation Area, but then obviously the watershed extends into Forest Service land, state lands, private lands, the county reserve down here in the lower basin. And so there's no one person or organization that's responsible for all sorts of data, but the Watershed Partnership saw its role as sort of coordinating the various data that's available among various agencies, organizations, and levels of government that are involved in the watershed, to sort of figure out, well, what is the state of the watershed? What is it like now? How has it changed from the past? How might it be changed? Now this is a long, involved process, and I only have 20 minutes, and I've tried to trim this down as much as I can. This was originally a 79-slide presentation. It's now about 25. Probably still too long, but we went through a process of working with various stakeholders, people filling out surveys. Probably many of you in this room filled out the survey to try to get down to a limited number of indicators. As Larry would tell you if he was here, I wanted to be at 12 indicators. We're still at 19, so I didn't get my wish, but we got it down to a reasonable, manageable number. But we've then composited them in areas like climate, water, ecological, and then sociocultural. So, and I'm going to walk through these sort of 4 areas and give you the highlights of the sort of things that jump out of that state of the watershed. I'm not going to talk about everything. There's some things that aren't changing very much, or we don't have enough data about that I'm not going to emphasize as much. But I'm going to try to emphasize sort of the things that we've learned about the current state of the watershed, and some of the things we learned along the way about how to pull together data that I think were an important outcome of the process, more on sort of the capacity building within the basin than anything else. Okay, and also I've learned to give acknowledgments up front because I always forget to give them at the end. And so acknowledgments here are widespread, right? This isn't something that Adriana and Larry and I and Sheila did, who were the co-authors on this abstract. It's really something a very wide list of cooperators have done, from a laundry list of agencies, and like I said, levels of government from local to federal, and NGOs, and different aspects of government in the region. Okay, so climate. What's the climate of this basin like? How has it been changing or not? So this is precipitation in the basin for the 3 months ending in September, so July, August, September. So this is the summer monsoon. 10 inches is right here. There's the long-term average, about 8 inches of precipitation during those 3 summer monsoon months, versus the 3 months ending in February, December, January, February. So the heart of our winter rainy season, not all of the rain that occurs outside of monsoon, but much of it. And of course, immediately a couple things jump out. One, we do have variability in precipitation over time. We have wetter periods like teens and 20s, the 60s, the 80s into the early 90s in terms of the summer monsoon, and the same with the winter precip, wetter periods in the early teens, a wet winter period in the 80s and 90s that other people have referred to as sort of this very wet period that sort of established some of the baseline conditions that a lot of us sort of expect to see, but that was somewhat of an anomaly long term in terms of the wetness of those winters, and a decline more recently. But importantly, no clear long-term trend in precipitation. there's sort of this variability that's driven by probably large-scale oceanic land and land-atmosphere interactions that drive the monsoon and our winter precipitation, but no clear pattern in long-term precipitation in the region. But the same cannot be said for temperature. Okay. So here's the temperature record going back to about 1900. And here you definitely see a profound pattern of sort of colder average temperatures to much warmer average temperatures more recently. And so an important thing to remember about temperature is not just what you feel outside, it's also importantly what plants feel. And temperature establishes the demand that the atmosphere places on how much water it can hold. The warmer it is, the more water vapor the atmosphere can hold, the greater demand it places on plants to release water to the atmosphere. And so temperature is a hydrologic variable. It is a water budget variable. The warmer it is, the more water the plants are going to use. And particularly in our riparian areas where plants don't have much of an off switch to stop evapotranspiring water, that those warmer temperatures are going to lead to greater water demands now versus in the past. Okay? And importantly, those temperature changes also lead to longer growing seasons. The longer growing season just means plants are green longer, they're using more water. We're in a drought. I think everyone here kind of knows that. We've seen in the last couple of years maybe some lessening of that. But we have experienced droughts very similar to the one we're experiencing now back in the 45 to 65 period. Dave Brashears at the U of A has done some work showing precipitation-wise we're almost identical to that earlier drought. He's argued that the key difference of this more recent drought is that warmer temperature. It's 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. And so the plants are responding slightly differently. We've seen forests die off and tree die off elsewhere. Here it's likely seeing some aspect of sort of rangeland conditions. But these two graphs here are simply different averaging periods. This is a 4-year average versus a 12-month sort of window onto the drought conditions, sort of the barf diagram that was mentioned earlier. This is sort of another way of sort of looking at that long, drought is not any one thing. It's our perception of the climate conditions on the ground and how it's affecting water, wildlife, vegetation. Okay. So that's sort of the climate. We're warmer now than we used to be. Precipitation doesn't show a discernible pattern over time, but we are sort of we can cross our fingers coming out, but we're still in this sort of 20-year drought that we've been in. Now, one key resource that's available in this watershed that's not available, as Catla was saying about wet-dry mapping, is BLM and Pima County, along with cooperators, have been doing wet-dry mapping in this watershed now since the 1990s in different parts, but in a coherent way since 2006 in the upper basin on BLM lands, and then in the lower basin on Pima County's lands. And one of the things you see here is in 2006 to today, sort of a drop in sort of the miles of stream that are wet, and then an increase more recently in these last couple of years where it's been wet. This is, I believe, data just for actually this is the whole basin. But what you see, particularly in the lower basin, is the lower part of the watershed up to 2014, this drying out that you see. So a loss of those longer perennial reaches into shorter reaches, but with some recovery in the last 2 years. Okay. So that's sort of the spatial picture of water, of how wetness and dryness is changing, and here is sort of a discernible pattern of sort of recent climate variability. But when we take a longer view of perennial flow in Cienega Creek in the Pima County Reserve, we have this flow length in the late 80s as part of the Animax mine investigations. You sort of see 7 to 10 miles of wetted reach down the lower part of the county reserve. There's a data gap. A reminder that data gaps are evil, and you should all do everything you can stop. You should all do everything you can to prevent data gaps from happening, because we don't really obviously know what happened there. And we know that the winter of 1993, for example, was one of the wettest winters we've had in a very long time, as was the winter of 1998. But despite that, there's this continuing decline in flow length, perennial flow length, in the county reserve in the lower part of the basin. And it's not clear, is this period back here a result of the relatively wet climate? Is it, and this drying is simply a climatic variability aspect? Is this an effect of the temperature change? Is it an effect of development in the basin with more exempt wells being put in by homeowners over time? The short answer is we don't know, or probably some combination of the above. Okay, so that's water, sort of writ large. Long term, we can see that there's been a drying in the basin, and we don't yet have the information, I think, to specifically ascribe causation. But we can tell you the pattern, particularly in the lower basin, has been drying. The upper basin, on the National Conservation Area, there's been less of a change. Okay. So how about wildlife? Those nice, pretty pronghorn that you saw on the way here. This is not all the data about pronghorn in the region, but we did used to have sort of higher counts of pronghorn back in the 90s, late 80s and 90s, a drop in the early 2000s, which resulted in Game and Fish and partners saying, okay, what's going on here? How can we manage this system differently? And more recently, a recovery in pronghorn numbers through, as was noted, changes in grazing practices, removal of fences, putting in more watering locations for cattle, which have the added benefit of watering pronghorn as well. And so there's been these management responses, and they've had arguably the desired effect. So really a nice confirmation here of adaptive management and fundamental wildlife science about how to manage wildlife populations to the benefit of this iconic species. Okay. Similarly, the partnership's been heavily involved in frog restoration efforts in the basin, along with BLM, the ranchers, and various other partners. And back here in the 1980s, we have the geographic distribution of the leopard frog, the green line here, okay? And the black X's here show where there were bullfrogs noted to be present within the basin. Okay. By 2010, a couple refugia for Chiricahua leopard frogs, but now the black lines are showing where the bullfrogs have come over. So the bullfrogs are an introduced species. Bullfrogs basically, if my understanding is correct, Dennis is probably somewhere here to correct me. Right, bullfrogs essentially crowd out and eat the Chiricahua leopard frogs. And so the management strategy to get from here to here has been to remove the bullfrogs. And now you see with the green, the leopard frog largely returned to its historic range. Still a few isolated bullfrogs left, notably not on public lands, but out on private lands outside the reserve. Okay, and that sort of graphical picture is sort of repeated here, sort of 2011, over 1,200 bullfrogs. Bullfrog eradication efforts start, and there's a lag, but then the Chiricahua leopard frogs increasing in response. So again, a cooperative effort among state and federal agencies, the partnerships contractors, to do things on public lands, to engage with private landowners, to get rid of the bullfrogs, to sort of enable the Chiricahua leopard frogs to return to their previous range. Okay, so given the past couple months in the basin, I thought I'd emphasize sort of the wildfire record in the basin. And one of the things about the wildfires in the basin is that historically there haven't been very large wildfires. So here we are in the 1950s, a couple small wildfires in the forest portions of the basin. The 1960s, a relatively large fire in the Whetstones, a couple in the Santa Rita range. 70s, a couple other small fires in the basin, same in the 80s. The 1990s, a relatively large fire, sort of in the bridge between the upper and lower basin, on the very northern fringe of the basin. Large fires in the Santa Ritas and the Rincons in the 2000s. More recent large fires within the basin. And so what you see with fire, not surprisingly, is a highly variable record. Large fire burn areas in the 60s, the 90s, and the 2000s. Maybe there's an increase in burn area, maybe there isn't. With fire records, it's a harder thing to assess statistically because of the inherent interannual and decadal variability of fire. But obviously this year we had this sawmill fire, which if you look at this map, sort of extends sort of across this region. So it's one of the larger fires in the record in the basin. And so it's likely to have a long-term effect. We're going to find out about what that effect will be. Okay. So that was sort of the ecological aspect. So on the socio-cultural, I want to sort of discuss something related to archaeological site conditions. So the variety of organizations, the landowners and agencies involved, the State Land Department, the county, the various federal agencies, the partnership sort of got together as part of this State of the Watershed project and said, well, how do we know what the state of historical and archaeological sites is in this basin? They didn't have, previously they hadn't coordinated. But the State of the Watershed project encouraged them to sort of sit down and talk and figure out, okay, how do we create sort of a unified way to look at site status within the basin, so we don't even yet have the baseline, but we now have a process to go through to figure out, well, what is the state of archaeological and historical sites within this basin? Okay. One other aspect of the sociocultural that we've been able to look at is sort of, we want to know what the pressure is on the land in terms of recreational use. How many people are out there utilizing the resource, seeing the resource? There's a variety of ways to do that, but one of the ones we struck on was the permitting process for the county preserve in the lower basin. Here's the number of permits and the number of people over time. You can see that it's going up. That's probably a combination of both more people knowing they need a permit, but also more people using the resource. And on the other hand, sort of the annual passes to school organizations has sort of, it's a relatively low level here, right? There aren't that many schools out there engaging with the resource. And the feedback from people in schools organizations has been the lack of restroom facilities in some areas. Right? A school group goes out, they want a bathroom that can be used by the students. Okay. So I'm not going to go over all this, but right, we were able through this to get a sense of the overall trends. There's this increase in temperature, no clear trend in precipitation. We've been experiencing a period of drought. More recently, some smaller trends. Groundwater levels, I didn't emphasize this, but groundwater data, we've emphasized along the streams. We've gotten feedback that maybe we need to look more broadly. We've seen decreases in flow in the lower part of the basin, but not in the upper part of the basin. We've seen these specific recoveries of pronghorn and frogs, recovering of fish, and the introduction of prairie dogs. And we're starting to get some information about sort of on the social cultural side, the use of the resource, the engagement of people with the landscape. And we're able, I think, getting to the point where we're going to be able to get a common assessment of the cultural resources, the archaeological data. And with that, I will take questions.